After my grandma's funeral, my cousin David stood up, smirking, and shouted, "She gave me her house!" Everyone gasped. He shoved a crumpled note in my face, claiming it was proof. What he didn't know was that the real documents were locked away where only I could find them. This is the story of how one funeral turned into the ugliest family fight I have ever seen, filled with lies, betrayal, and a truth no one was ready for. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. It all started 3 days before the funeral. I had flown back to my hometown, a small place in Minnesota, to help organize things after Grandma passed away. My grandma, Margaret Lane, was the strongest woman I ever knew. She raised me after my parents' divorce and always told me that honesty was the one thing that could never be stolen. She lived in an old white house at the edge of town, the same house she'd inherited from her parents. Everyone in the family loved that place. It was more than wood and bricks. It was where all the family memories lived. I had always believed it would stay in the family, and I never questioned that it would one day be mine. David, my cousin, was the complete opposite of Grandma. He had charm, sure, but it was the kind that wore off quickly. He was the kind of person who smiled at you while calculating what he could take from you. He had money problems for as long as I could remember, mostly because he spent more than he earned. Grandma knew this. She used to warn me, "Emma, don't let that boy sweet-talk you. He'll take the shirt off your back if you let him." Still, I never thought he'd stoop this low. The funeral was emotional. I sat in the front row, holding back tears, remembering her laugh, her Sunday breakfasts, her garden. After the ceremony, we all went to the reception in the church hall. People were hugging, sharing stories about Grandma when David made his announcement. "She left me her house," he shouted, raising a folded paper high in the air. Everyone turned to look at him. He unfolded the paper dramatically as if he were revealing a treasure map. "This is her note, written in her own hand. It says she wants me to have it." His voice was loud, confident, and the room went silent. I looked at the paper but didn't touch it. From where I stood, I could see it was just a torn page from a notebook. The handwriting was messy, but it did look like Grandma's. My stomach tightened. If I hadn't known the truth, maybe I would have believed him. But I knew something David didn't. 2 weeks before Grandma passed, she had called me to her side. She'd taken my hand, looked me in the eyes, and told me exactly where to find her will. She had even made me promise to keep it safe until the time came. That will was locked in a safety deposit box at the town's bank, under my name. I could have called him out right then. I could have told everyone that his note was worthless. But something inside me told me to wait. I wanted to see how far David was willing to go with his lie. Relatives started whispering, some looking at me, some at him. My Aunt Linda, who always believed David could do no wrong, came up and hugged him. "I knew she loved you best," she said. My uncle shook his head in disbelief. I took a deep breath and walked toward David. "That's interesting," I said calmly. "Where did you find this note?" He smirked. "In her nightstand, right after she passed. Guess she wanted me to find it." "Uh-huh," I said, pretending to be impressed. "Well, if Grandma wanted you to have the house, I'm sure there's a way to make it official." His eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" "Oh, you know," I shrugged. "The will, the legal process, that kind of thing. But I'm sure you've got it all figured out." He didn't like my tone. "I don't need a lawyer to know what she wanted," he snapped. I smiled politely and walked away. I knew then that this was only the beginning. That night I sat in my childhood bedroom, staring at the old wallpaper, thinking about my next move. I had the upper hand, but if I showed my cards too soon, David might find a way to twist things. He was cunning. I decided I'd let him play his game a little longer. That way, when the truth came out, it would crush every lie he'd told. The next morning, David posted on Facebook that he was the proud new owner of Grandma's beautiful house. People started congratulating him. Some relatives even sent him private messages asking when they could visit. I didn't comment. I watched quietly, saving screenshots of everything. By the second day, he was already making plans to renovate the house. He even called a local contractor for an estimate, bragging about his inheritance. I knew I couldn't let it go too far, but I also couldn't risk making a scene without proof in hand. That proof was in the bank, and I'd be there soon. The morning after the funeral, I told David I needed to go pick up a few things from Grandma's house. He hesitated, probably afraid I'd find something that could expose him, but eventually agreed. When I got there, the house smelled like her lavender perfume. Her quilt still lay folded on the couch. I felt a lump in my throat. I walked into her bedroom, opened the nightstand, and saw where he had probably found that piece of paper. I found a few more scraps with her handwriting, grocery lists, recipes, reminders. It wouldn't be hard for him to forge a note using those. I took photos of everything, just in case. Before I left, I stood in the middle of the living room and whispered, "Don't worry, Grandma. I'll make this right." The next step was to visit the bank. That safety deposit box was the key to everything. Inside, I knew I'd find the original will, signed, dated, and witnessed. Once I had that, David's little performance would be over. But what I didn't know at the time was that he was already plotting his next move. The morning after I decided to visit the bank, I woke up earlier than usual. My stomach felt heavy, like it always does before something important. I got dressed, grabbed my coat, and drove through the chilly Minnesota air. The streets were quiet, except for a few early risers clearing snow from their driveways. As I pulled into the parking lot of First County Bank, I could feel my heart beating faster. This wasn't just about proving David wrong anymore. This was about protecting Grandma's last wishes. Inside, the bank smelled faintly of coffee and fresh paper. A woman named Carol, who had worked there for years, greeted me with a warm smile. "Emma, I was so sorry to hear about Margaret," she said gently. "Thanks, Carol," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to access my safety deposit box." She nodded, led me to the private room, and unlocked the small metal door with 2 keys, hers and mine. When I pulled the box out and set it on the table, my hands trembled a little. I opened the lid, and there it was, the original will, inside a yellow envelope with "Property of Margaret Lane" written in her neat handwriting. I slid the document out carefully. It was dated, signed, and witnessed by 2 neighbors. It clearly stated that the house, along with all belongings inside it, was to go to me. Not David. Not anyone else. Me. My eyes stung for a moment. Grandma had trusted me completely. I took out my phone and snapped several pictures of every page. I wasn't going to let this document out of my sight without a digital backup. Then I placed it back in the envelope and returned it to the box. That way, even if someone tried to accuse me of tampering, I'd still have proof it had never left the bank. As I left the bank, I spotted David's car parked down the street. My stomach sank. Was he following me? I tried to act normal, walked to my car, and drove away like nothing had happened. But in my rearview mirror, I could see him pulling out behind me. I decided to test him. Instead of going home, I drove to the grocery store. I spent 20 minutes wandering the aisles, picking up random items I didn't even need. When I came back out, David's car was still there. He wasn't subtle. He was sitting in the driver's seat, pretending to scroll on his phone. I walked straight to his window and knocked. He jumped. "Oh, hey, Emma," he said, forcing a smile. "Fancy seeing you here." "Cut it out, David," I said, my voice sharp. "Why are you following me?" He laughed nervously. "I'm not following you. I just happen to be in the neighborhood." "Right," I said, not believing a word. "Well, if you're so interested in what I'm doing, maybe you should just ask instead of hiding in your car like a creep." His smile faded. "I know you went to the bank," he said quietly. I froze for half a second, then shrugged. And I think I know what you're up to," he said. "You're trying to take the house from me." I almost laughed. "David, the only reason you think it's yours is because you made up some pathetic story and waved around a scrap of paper. That's not how the law works." His jaw tightened. "We'll see about that." I got into my car and drove off, but the encounter left me uneasy. If David knew I had been to the bank, he might try to get to the will before I could use it. That meant I had to move faster. That evening, I called my friend Sarah, who worked as a paralegal. She had helped me with paperwork before and was someone I could trust completely. I explained the situation, and she told me to bring her the pictures of the will. "This is airtight, Emma," she said after looking at them. "He doesn't have a leg to stand on. But if you want this done right, we need to get a lawyer involved before he starts spreading more lies. The next day, I met with a lawyer named Robert Hill. He was in his late 50s with kind eyes and a calm voice. I handed him the photos and he studied them carefully. "This is solid," he said, "but be prepared if your cousin is as stubborn as you say, he won't go down without a fight. He may try to challenge the will even if he has no case." I nodded. "I know, that's why I haven't told him yet." Robert leaned back in his chair. "Good. Let him dig his own hole first. The deeper he goes, the easier it'll be to prove he's lying." And that's exactly what I decided to do. The next few days were strange. David kept posting pictures of the house on social media, talking about his future renovations. He even shared a post saying he was planning to sell it and move to Florida. Relatives started calling me, asking if it was true. I didn't confirm or deny, I just told them the truth would come out soon. One night, I got a call from Aunt Linda. "Emma," she said, "I think you should just let David have the house. He's been through a lot and it would mean so much to him." I took a deep breath. "Aunt Linda, this isn't about what he wants. This is about Grandma's wishes, and I'm not going to let her be disrespected like that." She sighed heavily and hung up. I knew she'd go straight to David and tell him I wasn't backing down. The turning point came a week later. I got a text from a neighbor who lived across from Grandma's house. It was a photo of David loading boxes into a moving truck. He was taking furniture, rugs, even her old sewing machine. I felt my blood boil. Not only was he claiming the house, he was clearing it out before the legal process was even done. I drove straight there. The truck was parked in the driveway, and David was carrying out a box when I pulled up. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted, slamming my car door. He smirked. "Just making room for the renovations, my renovations." I stepped closer, my voice shaking with anger. "You can't take a single thing from this house until ownership is legally decided. You're stealing." He laughed. "Stealing? You're the one trying to steal from me." That's when I pulled out my phone and hit record. "Say that again," I told him. He glared at me but repeated it. "You're trying to steal my house." "Perfect," I said. "Thanks for confirming you think it's yours. This will look great in court." His expression darkened, but I didn't care. I had the will, I had proof of his lies, and now I had video evidence of him taking things that didn't belong to him. It was time to stop playing nice. I called Robert the next morning and gave him everything: the will photos, the video, the screenshots from social media. He said we could file an emergency motion to prevent David from touching anything in the house until the court decided ownership. The hearing was set for the following week. I didn't tell David. I wanted him to walk in unprepared, thinking he had already won. But deep down, I knew he wasn't going to make this easy. He had something else up his sleeve, and I was about to find out what it was. The week before the court hearing felt like the longest of my life. I was constantly checking my phone, half expecting David to try something else before we faced the judge. I kept replaying the moment I saw him emptying Grandma's house. It made my blood boil every time. I didn't tell him about the court date, but I suspected word might eventually reach him. People in our family talk, and not always in helpful ways. 2 days before the hearing, I was in my kitchen making coffee when my phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize. "Emma Lane?" the voice asked. "Yes," I replied cautiously. "This is Detective Harris with the county police. We received a complaint about you allegedly stealing property from your late grandmother's home." My stomach dropped. "What? That's ridiculous." "Well, the complainant provided a statement claiming you entered the home and removed valuable items without authorization," he continued. I almost laughed. "Detective, the property is in dispute, and I have legal proof it was left to me in my grandmother's will. The other party is my cousin, who has been trying to take the house illegally." He paused. "All right, ma'am, I'll note your side. But you should know that any further removal of items before the hearing could cause complications. Let the court decide." The moment I hung up, I knew exactly what had happened. David had tried to flip the situation, accuse me of doing exactly what he was doing. Classic. Later that day, I got a text from my friend Sarah. "You're not going to believe this. David hired a lawyer, and not just any lawyer, he got Alan Price." The name made my skin crawl. Alan Price was known for being aggressive in court, twisting words, and making the other side look bad. If David hired him, it meant he was going all in. I called Robert immediately. "We need to be ready," I told him. "We will be," he assured me. "Just stick to the facts. The will is on our side, and the judge will see that. But be prepared for them to try and make you look like the villain." The morning of the hearing, I wore my grandmother's silver brooch on my coat, a small reminder that I was doing this for her. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and coffee. My palms were sweaty as we entered the small courtroom. David was already there, wearing a suit that looked too expensive for someone who claimed to be broke. Alan Price sat beside him, shuffling papers like a man preparing for battle. When the judge entered, everyone stood. My heart was pounding. This was it. Robert presented our case first. He showed the court the will, the photos, the witness signatures, and explained that the house was legally mine. Then he played the video of David removing items from the home and my conversation with him, where he openly claimed the house. The judge listened carefully, occasionally scribbling notes. I felt a small surge of hope. Then it was Alan's turn. He stood up and walked to the center like he owned the place. "Your Honor," he began, "while my learned colleague here has presented a will, we believe there is compelling evidence that Margaret Lane intended to make a last-minute change in favor of my client, David Lane." I frowned. "What?" I whispered to Robert. Alan pulled out a clear plastic sleeve. Inside was a piece of lined paper. "This is a handwritten note, discovered in Margaret's bedroom, which clearly states her wish for David to have the property." My jaw tightened. I recognized the paper instantly. It was the same fake note David had waved around at the funeral. Alan continued, "We believe the will my opponent has presented was drafted before this note, and therefore, this handwritten document represents her final wishes." I couldn't stay silent. "That's a lie," I blurted out. The judge gave me a sharp look, and Robert placed a hand on my arm, silently telling me to let him handle it. Robert stood. "Your Honor, this so-called note is undated, unsigned, and unwitnessed. Furthermore, the handwriting, while similar to the deceased's, cannot be authenticated without forensic analysis. We maintain that the will, which is legally binding, is the only valid document here." Alan smirked. "We would be happy to have a handwriting expert examine it." The judge leaned back. "All right. I'm ordering both parties to submit the note and the will for handwriting verification and authenticity testing. Until then, no changes to the property will be made by either side." I felt my stomach twist. This meant more delays, exactly what David wanted. The longer it dragged out, the more time he had to play his games. After the hearing, we walked out of the courthouse, and David stopped me on the steps. "You're not going to win, Emma," he said, his voice low. "Grandma wanted me to have that house, and I'll make sure I get it, even if it takes years." I looked him straight in the eye. "The difference between us, David, is that I have the truth. You just have lies." He smirked and walked away. Over the next 2 weeks, the handwriting experts did their work. They compared the note to other samples of Grandma's writing, including her will, recipes, and letters. When the results came back, I almost cried with relief. The experts' report clearly stated that while the handwriting on the note was, likely, hers, there were inconsistencies that suggested copying or tracing from existing samples. In other words, it was a forgery. Armed with this, Robert filed a motion to have the note dismissed as evidence. The judge set another hearing date. But David wasn't done. A few days before the next hearing, I got a message from an unknown account on social media. It was a picture of my car, parked outside the bank. The caption read, "Better watch your back." My heart pounded. I didn't know if it was David or someone he sent, but the message was clear. He wanted to scare me. I called Robert and the police, filing a harassment report. The officer I spoke to warned me to be careful. The next hearing was tense. Robert presented the expert's report, and the judge finally dismissed the fake note. I thought that would be the end of it. But then Alan Price stood up again. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "we have a witness who claims that Margaret Lane verbally told them, just days before her death, that she wanted David to have the house." I froze. Who could it be? The courtroom door opened, and in walked Aunt Linda. My stomach dropped. "Do you swear to tell the truth?" the clerk asked. "I do," she said firmly. Alan asked, "Mrs. Linda Parker, can you tell the court what Margaret Lane said to you?" Linda looked directly at me before answering. "She told me she was going to change her will to give David the house because she knew Emma didn't need it." It felt like a punch to the chest. I could barely breathe. Robert stood up. "Your Honor, verbal statements cannot override a legal will. This testimony is irrelevant." The judge nodded. "I'm aware, Mr. Hill, but I will consider the testimony as context." I wanted to scream. It didn't matter that Linda's words couldn't legally change the will. They still painted me as greedy in the judge's mind. When the hearing ended, I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. David was pulling out every trick in the book, and I had no idea what he'd try next. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let him win, even if it meant digging into parts of the past I'd never wanted to touch, because somewhere in that past was the leverage I needed to end this once and for all. After the hearing, I drove home in silence. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight they ached. Aunt Linda's testimony had been a low blow, even if it wasn't legally strong enough to change the outcome. I could feel the damage it did in the judge's eyes. It made me look like someone who was ignoring Grandma's true wishes, and that's exactly what David wanted. I sat in my driveway for a while before finally going inside. My cat, Molly, rubbed against my legs, purring, completely unaware of the storm outside our little home. I envied her peace. That night, I called Sarah again. "I need something on David," I told her. "Something solid that will make the judge see exactly who he is." Sarah hesitated. "Like what, dirt?" "Yes," I said plainly. "If the truth isn't enough to win this easily, then I need more truth, the kind that shows what kind of person he's been for years. I know there's something. Grandma hinted about it once, but she never told me the details." Sarah's voice dropped. "Emma, I might know where to start. Do you remember when David had that business a few years back? The one that suddenly closed?" "Yeah," I said slowly. "He told everyone it failed because of the economy." She paused. "That's not the whole story. I had a client back then who mentioned that David was under investigation for fraud. Nothing public ever came out, but the business dissolved right after. If there's a paper trail, it might still be in the county records." The next morning, I went to the courthouse's public records office. The clerk, an older man named Henry, looked up David's name in the system. "Huh," he said after a few clicks. "Looks like there were complaints filed against him for taking deposits from clients and never delivering the promised work. The cases were dropped when he refunded some money, but one woman filed a sworn statement saying she never got her money back." My heart raced. "Can I get copies?" "Sure," Henry said, printing the documents. "Public record, just $1 per page." I left with a small stack of papers. Not enough to send him to jail, but definitely enough to show he had a history of dishonest behavior. Later that day, I stopped by Grandma's house. I still had a spare key, and the court order said neither of us could change the locks or alter access. I wasn't there to take anything, just to feel close to her. But as I walked through the living room, I noticed something odd. On the side table near her armchair was a small wooden box I had never seen before. It was old, with a brass latch and no key. I picked it up and felt how light it was. Curiosity got the better of me. I took it home, found a thin hairpin, and gently worked the latch open. Inside, there were a few letters, tied with a ribbon, and a faded photograph. The photo was of Grandma, much younger, standing beside a man who was definitely not my grandfather. They were smiling in front of the same white house. The letters were even more surprising. They were from this man, whose name was Thomas Reed. The most recent one was dated just 10 years ago. In it, he wrote about our agreement and how he was glad she had kept her promise about the boy. I read it 3 times before the meaning started to sink in. The boy, could it be David? I called my mom, who was living in another state, and asked her about Thomas Reed. There was a long pause. "Emma," she said carefully, "Thomas was, well, he was part of the family in a way. Your grandmother had a relationship with him after your grandfather passed. David's mother knew him very well." I felt my pulse quicken. "Are you saying Thomas could be David's real father?" "I'm saying it's possible," she replied. "And if that's true, there may be more to why your grandmother treated him differently." This was a bombshell. If David was not legally Grandpa Lane's son, then he might not even be entitled to challenge the will at all, depending on the exact family trust rules. I needed proof. The next day, I went to the county health department and requested David's birth certificate. It listed his mother's name, but left the father's section blank. Interesting. Then I searched the old archives for any mention of Thomas Reed. I found that he had passed away 7 years ago, leaving no children on his official record. But there was an old property deed showing he had once co-owned a cabin with Margaret Lane. I called Robert. If David isn't legally recognized as a descendant of the Lane family, does that change anything? Robert's tone shifted instantly. "Yes, if we can prove it, it weakens his standing in this case. But you'll need more than speculation. You'd need either a legal acknowledgement from his mother or a DNA test." Getting a DNA test without David's consent would be tricky. But maybe his mother, Aunt Linda, could be persuaded or cornered. That evening, I drove to her house. She opened the door with a scowl. "What do you want, Emma?" "I want the truth," I said flatly, "about David's father." Her eyes flickered, just for a second, and I knew I had hit something. "That's none of your business." "It is when it affects a legal case," I replied. "I found letters from Thomas Reed to Grandma. You can deny it, but the fact is, his birth certificate doesn't list a father. If the court finds out, this case could take a very different turn for David." Linda's lips tightened. "You're digging in places you shouldn't." I stepped closer. "I'm giving you a chance to be honest before this comes out in front of the whole family." For a long moment, she just stared at me. Then she sighed, her shoulders sinking. "Fine. Thomas was David's father. Margaret promised me she'd look out for him because, well, Thomas wasn't the kind of man who stayed in one place. He didn't want the responsibility." I felt a mix of sympathy and frustration. So Grandma helped raise him out of guilt, not because she wanted him to have everything. Linda didn't answer. She just closed the door in my face. I walked back to my car with a strange sense of clarity. Now I had something real. This wasn't about being cruel. It was about showing the court the full truth. If David wanted to drag Grandma's name through the mud with forged notes and fake stories, then he needed to be ready for the real family history to come out. I called Robert again, explained what happened, and told him I was willing to testify to what Linda had admitted. He agreed that it could be useful, especially if Linda denied it under oath. Lying to the court was a serious matter. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. I half expected David to send another threatening message or try to spin a new story. But he didn't. Instead, the silence felt like the calm before a storm. The next hearing was scheduled for Monday morning. Robert planned to submit the fraud records, the harassment report, and the new paternity angle. He told me to be ready for fireworks. And he was right. When we walked into the courtroom, David was already there, looking smug. But the moment Robert started questioning him about his business history, his expression changed. Then Robert moved on to the birth certificate. David's lawyer objected immediately, but the judge allowed the line of questioning, saying it could be relevant to standing. Finally, Robert said, "Mr. Lane, can you state for the record the name of your biological father?" David's face went pale. "My father was John Lane," he said stiffly. "That's not what your birth certificate says," Robert replied, holding up the document. "It says father unknown." Alan Price jumped up, demanding a recess. The judge granted 15 minutes. David stormed out into the hallway, and when he saw me, he hissed, "You think you're clever, Emma? You've just made a big mistake." I didn't flinch. "The only mistake here is yours, thinking you could steal from me and Grandma's memory." When we went back in, the judge didn't make a ruling yet, but I could see the shift. The tide was turning in my favor. Still, I knew David wouldn't go down quietly, and I had a gut feeling that in trying to win this, he might just do something that would end up destroying him completely. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw David smirk and heard his voice saying, "The house is mine." I knew it wasn't true. I knew Grandma trusted me with the real papers. But I also knew that if I made one wrong move, David could twist everything against me. He was smart in a dangerous way. He knew how to get people on his side. The next morning, I got a call from Mrs. Harper, Grandma's lawyer. She said, "Emma, I've been reviewing the will again. You need to come to my office. And bring that envelope we talked about." My heart pounded. That envelope was hidden inside my bedroom closet, behind a loose panel in the wall. Grandma had given it to me 2 years ago, saying, "Only open this when you absolutely have to, and only if someone tries to take what's mine." I pulled out the envelope and stared at it. It felt heavy, even though it was just paper inside. Before I could leave for Mrs. Harper's office, my phone buzzed. A message from David. "We need to talk. Alone." I didn't want to meet him, but I also wanted to hear what game he was playing. We agreed to meet at the park. When I got there, David was already waiting on a bench, leaning back like he owned the place. He smiled, but it wasn't a nice smile. "Emma," he said, "you don't have to fight me. If you just let me have the house, I'll make sure you get a good share of the money when I sell it." I stared at him. "You think Grandma wanted her home to be sold?" I asked. He shrugged. "She's gone now. What she wanted doesn't matter. What matters is what we can get." Something in me burned. This wasn't just about property. This was about respect for Grandma's memory. I said, "David, you have no idea what's coming." I stood up and walked away. At Mrs. Harper's office, I handed her the envelope. She carefully opened it and pulled out the official will, notarized and signed. It clearly stated that the house, along with everything inside, was mine. Not David's, not anyone else. Mine. Mrs. Harper looked at me seriously. "Emma, this is strong evidence, but David is going to fight back. He might even accuse you of forging it. You need to be ready." I nodded. I knew the fight was far from over. That evening, David showed up at my door, uninvited. He stepped inside without asking, his eyes scanning the living room. "You think you're clever, Emma, but I know you've got something hidden. If you don't hand it over, I'll make sure the whole family turns against you." I didn't flinch. "Go ahead, David, try." For the first time, his confident look faded. He left without another word, but I knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of the real war between us. After David left my house that night, I stood in the doorway for a while, staring into the darkness outside. The street was quiet, but my mind was. I could feel the weight of what was coming. The will in my possession was the truth, but truth doesn't always win by itself. People like David don't stop until they've destroyed every obstacle in their way. And right now, I was his biggest obstacle. I locked the door and sat on the couch, turning over every memory of Grandma in my head. She raised me after my parents died. She taught me how to be strong without being cruel. But she'd also taught me something else, that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even if it means getting your hands dirty. The next morning, Mrs. Harper called again. "Emma," she said, "I need you to understand something. David has already filed a claim with the probate court. He's using that note he showed at the funeral as evidence." I felt my stomach twist. "But that note isn't real. Grandma never wrote it." "I know," Mrs. Harper replied, "but the judge doesn't know that yet. We'll need to prove it's fake." I asked, "How do we do that?" She hesitated. "We'll need handwriting analysis, witnesses, maybe even to dig into David's past for any proof of forgery." That's when I remembered something. A year ago, David had borrowed money from me, a small amount, and signed an IOU. His handwriting on that paper was messy and had a distinct slant. I still had it in a drawer. If I could compare it to the so-called note from Grandma, maybe we could prove he forged it. I told Mrs. Harper about it, and she said, "Bring it to me today." When I went to get the IOU, I noticed something else. David had left a voicemail on my phone from months ago, bragging about getting what he wanted no matter what it takes. I saved it. I didn't know if it would help legally, but it felt important. On my way to Mrs. Harper's office, I kept looking in the rearview mirror. I couldn't shake the feeling someone was following me. A black SUV kept appearing a few cars back. Every turn I took, it took two. Finally, I pulled into a grocery store parking lot. The SUV kept driving. Maybe I was just being paranoid, or maybe David was having me watched. When I got to Mrs. Harper's office, she examined the IOU and compared it to the note David had submitted. "Emma," she said slowly, "I'm not a handwriting expert, but these similarities are suspicious. We'll get a professional to confirm." I leaned forward. "Mrs. Harper, I'm not just fighting for a house. I'm fighting to protect Grandma's memory. I can't let David ruin it." She nodded. "Then be prepared. He's going to play dirty." 2 days later, dirty is exactly what he played. I woke up to find photos of me and Grandma posted online, with captions twisting our relationship. People were commenting things like, "She manipulated her grandma for the inheritance, and no wonder David is fighting for what's right." It was all lies, but lies spread fast. I knew this wasn't just about court anymore. It was about reputation. David wanted to make me look greedy and heartless so no one would side with me. That evening, I got another message from David. "You're not going to win, Emma. Even if the court rules in your favor, no one will believe you." I refused to respond. Instead, I called my best friend, Rachel. She'd known me and Grandma for years. When I told her everything, she said, "Emma, you need to fight fire with fire. If David is spreading lies, you need to tell the real story loud and clear." That's when I decided I would speak publicly. I would tell people what really happened from my own mouth, not to beg for sympathy, but to show the truth. The next morning, I recorded a video in my living room. I started with the words. After my grandma's funeral, my cousin stood up and claimed she gave him her house. He even waved a note in my face. But what he didn't know is that I have the real documents and the truth. I told the story simply, honestly, without insults. I ended the video by saying, "If you think family should be about love, not greed, then stand with me." I posted it online. By that evening, it had thousands of views. People started commenting things like, "David sounds like a liar," and "Stay strong, Emma." That night, David showed up at my house again. This time, he wasn't smiling. "You think you're clever," he hissed, "but you've just made the biggest mistake of your life." I didn't back down. "The biggest mistake would be letting you take what's not yours." He stepped closer. "You have no idea what I'm capable of." I met his stare. "And you have no idea what Grandma taught me." We stood there in silence for a moment before he finally turned and left. But as he walked away, he said something that chilled me. "See you in court, and maybe sooner." That night, I checked every lock in the house twice. I didn't know if his threat meant legal trouble or something much worse. The court date came faster than I expected. For days, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw David's smug face and heard Grandma's voice telling me, "Do what's right, even if it's hard." When I walked into the courtroom, David was already there. He was wearing a dark blue suit, hair slicked back, looking every bit the respectable man he wanted the judge to believe he was. But I could see the calculation in his eyes. Mrs. Harper whispered to me, "Remember, keep calm. Let the truth do the work." The judge entered, and we all stood. My heart was pounding so loud I thought everyone could hear it. David's lawyer started first, painting him as a devoted grandson who only wanted to carry out his grandmother's final wishes. Then they brought out the note. The one I knew was forged. The lawyer spoke like it was gospel, describing how Grandma had confessed her true intentions to David privately. When it was our turn, Mrs. Harper stood and said, "Your Honor, my client has the official, notarized will that leaves the house entirely to her. Furthermore, we have evidence that the note presented by Mr. David Parker is a forgery." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Evidence." That's when we called in Mr. Thompson, the handwriting expert. He walked to the stand, calm and confident. "I have compared the handwriting on the note with samples from Mrs. Parker's letters over the last 10 years, he said. "There are multiple inconsistencies, letter formation, pressure patterns, and slant. In my professional opinion, the note was not written by Mrs. Parker. David shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. Then Mrs. Harper added, "We also compared the note with Mr. Parker's handwriting. Here is an IOU he wrote to my client last year. As you can see, the similarities are striking, especially in the way the capital G and lowercase y are formed." The judge studied both papers for a long moment. I could feel my hands shaking. But it wasn't over yet. Mrs. Harper played the voicemail David had left me months ago, the one where he bragged about getting what he wanted no matter what it takes. David's lawyer objected, saying it was out of context, but the damage was done. The judge's expression had changed. Finally, it was my turn to speak. I stood, took a deep breath, and said, "Your Honor, my grandmother was more than family, she was my whole world. She raised me when I had no one else. She trusted me, and I promised to protect her legacy. I'm not here for money. I'm here because she believed in doing the right thing, and I won't let her memory be stolen by lies." There was silence in the courtroom. Even David didn't move. The judge looked at him. "Mr. Parker, do you have anything to say?" David hesitated, then tried to speak, but his voice cracked. I just thought," he stopped. The confidence was gone. The judge finally spoke. "Based on the evidence presented, the court finds the note to be a forgery. The will is valid. The property belongs to Miss Emma Parker. Mr. Parker, you are hereby warned that any further fraudulent claims will result in criminal charges." I felt like I could finally breathe again. David avoided my eyes as he left the courtroom. For the first time, he looked small, like the weight of his own greed had finally crushed him. Afterward, Mrs. Harper patted my shoulder. "You did it, Emma. You kept your promise to your grandmother." I stepped outside into the sunlight. The air felt different, lighter. I knew the fight had taken a lot out of me, but I also knew Grandma would be proud. That night, I sat on the porch of the house she left me. I imagined her rocking chair creaking beside me, her voice saying, "See, I told you the truth matters." I smiled through the tears. "I'm glad to have you here," I whispered. And for the first time in weeks, I wasn't afraid.